The first sound Kale made was a word. Not a cry, not a gasp. A word, spoken in the clipped, precise tones of a man who had been using language for 30 years and found it, on the whole, adequate. The technicians in the observation suite, above Bay 7, went very still. The Varric bioengineer named Soreth pressed one of her 4 hands flat against the cold glass and said something that the translator rendered as, "This is not what we expected." Nobody had expected anything like KL. The experiment had been running for 11 years. The Varric Dominion called it Project Threshold, a cognitive expansion trial conducted on 17 human subjects extracted from a population center in what the humans called the Ural foothills. 16 of those subjects had not survived the procedure. The 17th had not only survived, but had done something that none of the Varric models predicted. He had been born, not literally. Kale was 31 years old. He had memories, or something structured like memories, of a childhood, a mother's voice reading to him in a language that turned out to be Russian, the smell of rain on concrete, the particular quality of afternoon light, through a frosted glass window. None of it had happened. The cognitive expansion procedure, when it worked, and it had never worked before, apparently constructed a full interior history out of the raw material of a human mind. It did not simply upgrade the brain. It told the brain a story about itself, and the brain believed it. Soreth reported this to her superiors with the professional detachment of someone who had spent 4 decades studying biological anomalies. Her report was 11 pages and deeply technical, and buried in the middle of page 7 was a single sentence that her superiors should have paid more attention to. The subject appears to experience his own cognition as narrative rather than computation. They read the sentence, they did not understand it, they moved on. Kale spent the first 2 days reading. The Varric had stocked Base 7 with material intended to test baseline human literacy, simple pictographic primers, the kind of thing a child could work through in a week. Kale finished them in 40 minutes, flagged a technician, and asked for something more difficult. They gave him a technical manual for the facility's atmospheric management system. He read it in 90 minutes, and then spent the next 3 hours redesigning the ventilation routing in his head, identifying 2 structural inefficiencies and 1 critical failure point that the Varric engineers had not noticed in 11 years of operation. He did not tell them about this. What he told them was that he would like more books, please. Specifically, he said, detective novels, and anything with large explosions. The Varric found this amusing in the way that a researcher finds a laboratory animal's quirky behavior amusing. It was data, and data was always welcome. They brought him crates of digitized human fiction, thousands of volumes translated into formats his neural interface could receive. They thought they were studying his absorption rate. They were. They just didn't understand what absorption meant to him. To Kale, reading was not retrieval, it was occupation. When he read a detective novel, and he read dozens in those first weeks, classic mid-century procedurals, hard-boiled noir, the kind with cigarette smoke and rain-slicked streets and men who talked to corpses like old friends, he did not merely extract the plot. He moved in. He walked those streets. He learned the rules of that world from the inside, the way you learn the rules of a room by living in it, rather than by studying its blueprints. He read a spy thriller and became briefly a man who noticed exits first and faces second. He read a story about a wilderness survivor and spent 3 days cataloging every potential resource in Bay 7. He memorized the weight distribution of every piece of furniture, the cycle time of every door mechanism, the particular acoustic quality of the ventilation shaft at different hours. Not because he was planning something specific, but because the story he'd been reading had lived inside a man who knew his environment the way a musician knows an instrument. And Kale had moved into that way of knowing the way he moved into every framework, completely, without reservation, until it was his. He read a war novel, one of the human's own, written by someone who had been at Stalingrad, and went quiet for a long time afterward. The Varric monitoring team noted elevated stress indicators and logged it as an emotional response to thematic content. What they did not log was the specific thing Kale had understood, because they could not have understood it themselves, that the book was not about suffering. It was about the particular human skill of continuing to exist inside a situation that had been designed to kill you, not by denying the situation, but by insisting, quietly and without ceremony, on being more stubborn than it. He put the book down and looked at the ceiling of Bay 7 for a long time. The ceiling was white. Specifically, it was a particular Varric shade of white, that had a faint blue undertone intended to promote cognitive clarity in research subjects. Kale had read the facility design specifications, another manual he had absorbed in a single sitting, and knew that the color was deliberate, knew that the slightly elevated oxygen concentration in Bay 7 was deliberate, knew that the ambient temperature of exactly 19.4 degrees Celsius was deliberate, knew that everything about the room had been engineered to produce a specific state in a specific kind of mind. The problem was that his mind did not work the way they'd engineered for. He looked at the ceiling, and he thought about Stalingrad, and he asked for more books. What Kale did not tell the Varric in those first weeks was that he was building something, not a plan. Plans were brittle, plans assumed a fixed future, and Kale had read enough stories to know that the future was not fixed, only navigable. He was building a map, not of the facility, though that was part of it. A map of the gap between what the Varric thought he was and what he actually was. The Varric thought he was a cognitive database with an anomalous emotional response architecture. They were interested in the database. They were mildly puzzled by the emotional responses, but had categorized them as acceptable variants. Every week, a team of 3 researchers entered Bay 7 and ran him through a battery of retrieval exercises, recall accuracy tests, pattern recognition matrices, predictive modeling scenarios, and every week, Kale performed at approximately 82% of what he estimated his actual capacity to be. Not low enough to raise red flags, not high enough to reveal the shape of the gap. He had read about this too. Not in a spy novel, though he'd read dozens of those. In a book about chess, a human game, one of their oldest, in which the strategic ideal was not to display your full capability at any moment, but to maintain what the author called strategic ambiguity. The opponent should never know exactly what you can do, only that you have done something they didn't expect. Kale found this immediately comprehensible, in a way that suggested it was already native to him. Already part of whatever architecture the procedure had built, the way some words in a language feel like they were waiting for you before you ever learn them. He played chess against the Varric research team's modeling AI 3 times a week. He won consistently, at a level that impressed them, without alarming them. The AI's performance ceiling was well documented. Kale stayed just below it. He was, in all the ways that mattered, a perfect prisoner. Cooperative, curious, charming in the limited way that translated across species. He asked the technicians questions about their work, remembered their names, noticed when Soreth was having a difficult day, and asked her about it in a way that she later described to a colleague as unsettlingly perceptive. He was comfortable to be around, easy to forget in the daily rhythm of Bay 7 that he was not there by choice. That was part of the map too. The Solon Compact found out about Project Threshold on a Tuesday, which was not a concept the Solon had, but which is the best approximation of the day their intelligence network intercepted a Varric logistics transfer. 11 crates of human cognitive enhancement compounds routed to a black site research station in the outer Thresh territories. The Solon sent an agent. Her name was Avith, and she was a xenolinguist, which in Solon usage meant something closer to a cognitive archaeologist. Someone trained to excavate the meaning-making structures of non-Solon minds, to understand not just language, but the infrastructure of thought that language was built on. She had spent 12 years studying human communication patterns from archival recordings and intercepted transmissions, and she was very good at it, and she had very specific opinions about what the Varric were doing and why it was dangerous. The danger, as she understood it, was not that the Varric would create a super soldier or a weapons system or a strategic planning engine. Those were the threats her superiors had briefed her on, the threats both factions' military advisors had modeled. Evith's concern was different, and she had articulated it in a memo that her superiors had read politely and then set aside. The danger was that the Varric didn't actually understand what they'd made. An organization that didn't understand its own creation had no way of predicting what that creation would do when it decided to do something. She arrived at the facility's secondary access point disguised as a Varric compliance auditor, which worked because the Varric bureaucracy was enormous, and nobody in it had any particular reason to verify the credentials of someone carrying the right forms. The Compliance Audit Division had 1,700 active field staff and a reputation for showing up unexpectedly at research stations, so her presence caused mild annoyance but no alarm. She saw Kale through the observation glass on her 3rd day inside the facility. He was reading. He was always reading, the technicians said, rolling their secondary eyes in the Varric equivalent of exasperated fondness. Right now, he was deep in something. She couldn't see the title, and his face was doing something she had never seen a human face do in any of the archival footage she'd studied. It was entirely present. Not processing, not calculating. Present the way a body is present in a physical space, occupying the story he was in the same way he occupied the chair. She had spent 12 years studying humans. She had watched thousands of hours of their recorded interactions. She understood their grammar structures and their metaphor systems, and the way their emotional states manifested in vocal frequency and body posture. She had written a doctoral dissertation on the relationship between human narrative conventions and their decision-making frameworks. The way they organized experience into story shapes: protagonist, antagonist, rising action, climax, resolution. The way this organization was not merely cultural but structural, embedded in how they processed cause and effect. She had understood all of this academically. Watching Kale read, she understood it differently. She watched for longer than her mission profile recommended. She watched until he looked up from the book. Not at the observation window, which was one way, but at the ceiling, the way he apparently always did between sessions. And his eyes had the quality of someone returning from somewhere that had been more real, in that moment, than the room he was sitting in. She went back to her temporary quarters and read the Varek internal report she had copied from the research director's files. She read it 3 times, particularly page 7. The subject appears to experience his own cognition as narrative rather than computation. She sat with this for a long time. Then she went and unlocked his door. He didn't run. That was the first thing that surprised her. He stood up from his chair slowly, like someone who has been sitting for a long time, and whose back is aware of it. And he looked at her with an expression she classified as cautious but not afraid. He tucked the book under his arm. She caught the cover now, a human novel about a wilderness survivor, a man who endures alone in hostile terrain through sheer refusal to accept that he is supposed to die. And he said, in Russian, "So which side are you?" She answered in Russian. Her Russian was excellent. The other one, she said. That's useful information, he said. Are you here to extract me or study me? Primarily extract. And secondarily, she paused. Understand you. He considered this. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a new book, evaluating, deciding whether to go in. Can we go? He said. They got 4 corridors before the Varek security systems registered the breach. What happened next Avith would later describe in her mission debrief as operationally irregular, which was the most precise language she had available for watching a human man navigate a crisis the way experienced people navigate familiar streets. Not by following a map, but by reading the situation in real time and choosing, from some internal catalog of possible selves, the version best suited to the moment. When the security doors dropped, he didn't panic. He tilted his head like someone identifying a piece of music, said something in Russian that sounded almost amused, and moved. Not toward the obvious route, but toward the maintenance corridor she hadn't noticed. Behind a panel he could only have known about if he had read and memorized the facility's atmospheric management manual, which he had, she realized, on day 2. She followed him into a cramped space that smelled of recycled air and warm metal. You knew about this corridor, she said, for about 3 weeks. Why didn't you leave before? He was quiet for a moment. They were climbing now, a ladder that went upward through the facility's thermal exchange system. I wasn't ready, he said. Ready for what? I was reading, he said, as if this explained everything. It explained everything. They surfaced in the outer compound during a shift change, which Kale had calculated based on the ventilation cycle differentials in the atmospheric management system. Cycles that ran differently during crew transitions because the thermal load changed when the cafeteria units on the residential level powered up. He had been tracking the pattern for 11 days. He had not known he would need it in exactly this way. He had known he would need it in some way, because this was the other thing about living inside narrative. Information was never just information. It was always also leverage, always also a door, always also the thing you reached for in the moment before you needed it, if you had the wit to pick it up when you first encountered it. Avith had a ship docked at a civilian port 2 kilometers from the facility perimeter. They walked the 2 kilometers at a pace, fractionally faster than a stroll, and fractionally slower than something that would attract attention. Kale ate a piece of bread he had been keeping in his jacket pocket. 2 days, he said, just in case, and looked at the sky. The sky here was wrong. Purple tinged, the clouds the wrong weight. The light filtered through an atmosphere with a different mix of particulates than Earth's, giving the shadows a quality that was slightly too soft. the highlights slightly too diffuse, like a photograph taken through a lens that was almost, but not quite the right focal length. He had read that the Thresh territories had anomalous atmospheric composition, but reading it and standing under it were different things, and he spent a moment just looking at the wrong sky above an alien world. Eth watched him do this and thought about the word present again. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. What does it feel like?" "The way you think." He considered this. They kept walking, the facility receding behind them, the civilian port ahead still invisible over a low ridge. "You know when you're reading a very good book," he said, "and you forget you're reading? You're just there, in it. The story is real and you're real inside it, and the chair you're sitting in and the room around you are the things that feel like fiction." "Yes. It's like that," he said. "But I can't stop. I'm always inside something. Whatever situation I'm in, I'm also reading it, finding the shape of it, learning its rules, figuring out what happens next if the current pattern holds. I don't think in calculations. I think," he paused, reaching for language that fit, "in what comes next." "That's not how the Varric expected you to work." "No," he agreed. "They expected something more like them. A very fast version of them." He looked sideways at her. "What did your side expect?" She decided to be honest. "Much the same." He nodded like this confirmed something he'd already known. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." They reached the ridge. Below the civilian port was a cluster of low structures and 3 docked vessels, one of which was Aveth's. A Solon courier ship, small and agile, registered as commercial traffic. In the purplish alien light, it looked solid and real, and like a way out. She had expected, she realized, that reaching it would feel like the mission resolving into its endpoint. It didn't. It felt like the middle of something. The Varric sent 6 recovery teams within 2 hours of the breach. The Solon, learning through their own monitoring systems that Aveth had gone off mission and extracted the subject without authorization, sent 3 enforcement drones, and a recall order carrying the kind of language that in Solon bureaucratic convention preceded a full disciplinary review. Kale and Aveth spent 19 hours in a safe house in the Thresh lowlands, a gutted trading post left over from an earlier colonial period, its walls the color of old rust, the furniture improvised from shipping containers and salvaged equipment. The window looked out onto a flat gray plain that extended to a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. The silence was absolute except for the distant subsurface percussion of thermal venting. The lowlands were geologically active, the ground itself restless, unreliable for sensor arrays because the interference was too consistent to filter. He had chosen it for this reason. He had read about the lowland geology in a Solon cultural history that had been on Aveth's data tablet for reasons unrelated to the mission, downloaded 3 years ago when she'd been assigned to a border post and had intended to study the local environment before getting busy and forgetting about it. He had read it in their first hour in the safe house, along with everything else on the tablet. All of it. The intelligence files, the Varric internal research notes she'd copied from the director's archives, 3 human novels she'd had downloaded for years and never gotten to. He read with the total absorption she'd seen through the observation glass. Gone into each thing completely, returning between them with the slightly dazed quality of someone out of a cinema into daylight. The 3rd human novel was a romance. He read it last and was quiet for a long time afterward. "They're going to work together," he said. She looked up from her own reading. "What?" "Varric and Solon. When they figure out neither side can reach me independently, they'll run a joint operation." He reached over and typed something on the tablet's archived search interface. Page 43 of the Solon Joint Operation Protocols. Rival faction coordination triggers when the asset risk exceeds individual faction capacity. There's a precedent file. He paused. 3 years ago, Outer Thresh border dispute. A Solon faction and a Varric extraction team coordinated to recover a navigational data cache from a crashed survey vessel. He looked at her. "You were part of that operation." She had been. The file was classified, and she had not known it was on her tablet, buried in a backup archive from the border posting she'd had before this assignment. "You're not angry," she said, "about what they want to do with you." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the gray plane did nothing. Far away, thermal venting made its deep, regular sound, like a sleeping giant's breathing. "I've read a lot of stories about people who get angry about being wanted for the wrong reasons," he said. "It usually doesn't help them. The anger becomes the whole story, and they stop being the one steering it." He looked at the window. "I'd rather be the one choosing what happens next." "And what do you want to happen next?" He turned from the window. In the flat, rust-colored light, he looked like exactly what he was. A man who had come from nowhere, assembled out of a procedure that should have destroyed him, raised on fiction, walked out of a locked room under the wrong-colored sky. He looked, she thought, like every protagonist she had ever read, and also like none of them, because those were types and he was a person, which was the thing fiction always tried to achieve and always fell short of by the distance between the word for warmth and the actual sensation. I want to go somewhere neither of them can reach me, he said. Or find me. He stopped. Then he said, I want to find out what I am when nobody is trying to use me. I don't know if that place exists. Most places don't exist until someone goes to them, he said. That's the thing about stories. The territory only gets real once someone walks into it. She thought about this for a while. Outside, the thermal venting continued its deep rhythm. The recovery teams were out there somewhere, triangulating. They had time, probably. Not much. What would you do, she said, if you got there, wherever there is? He had the look of someone who has been asked a question they've been thinking about for a long time and have finally found language for. I'd keep reading, he said. Everything that's out there. Everything that's never been looked at. And then I'd go to the next thing. He paused. Humans have a word, explorers, but that translation is wrong. The actual meaning is something closer to person who goes to where the story hasn't happened yet, to find out what it is. You want to be a scout, she said. Someone who reads ahead, he said. For everyone who comes after. The joint Varric-Solon task force assembled in the outer Thresh territories 41 hours after Kale walked out of Bay 7, 17 ships. The best tracking systems, both factions could concentrate on a single location problem. Sophisticated behavioral modeling arrays that could predict movement patterns for cognitively enhanced subjects based on a comprehensive set of known behavioral parameters. The models predicted Eastern movement. The nearest information-dense environment was a mid-sized Varric administrative hub, 300 kilometers east. Cognitively enhanced subjects consistently prioritized high-information environments. The hub was the obvious destination. Kale went west. He went west because the cultural history of the Thresh territories, which he had read while the task force was assembling, described the western lowlands as having two specific properties: anomalous, subsurface thermal activity that disrupted sensor arrays, and a tradition among the indigenous Thresh population of using the natural hot springs as neutral meeting ground. Territory where neither faction, by very old convention, had operational authority, because the springs predated both factions' presence in the region by several thousand years, and the indigenous peoples had negotiated their neutrality into every treaty both factions had signed with the local governments. He knew about this because he had read a cultural history downloaded 3 years ago and forgotten by its owner. He also knew about it because the last novel he'd read, the romance, the one about a woman who kept a lighthouse and a man who kept coming back to the wrong coast, had a scene set at a hot spring, and the scene had stayed with him the way scenes stay when they've landed somewhere deep. And when he'd read the Thresh cultural history 3 hours later, the two pieces of information had found each other in his mind the way things find each other in stories. Not through logic, but through resonance. The meeting was Avith's idea. Or rather, Kale suggested it. Avith understood immediately, and she agreed because she was a xenolinguist, and xenolinguists understand, more than most, that communication is a form of structural power. Not soft power, not metaphor, but the actual capacity to determine what happens next. She contacted the Joint Task Force through her Solon identification. She told them she and the subject were at a location she would transmit, and that the subject wished to speak to both faction representatives before any extraction attempt. The Varric commander sent back, "This is not a negotiation, the subject is Varric property." The Solon command sent back, "The subject is a Solon recovery target, the agent has gone rogue, this communication is unauthorized." Kale read both responses and smiled. Not a happy smile, but the smile of a person who has been reading a story carefully enough to see where it was going before it got there. "Good," he said. "They both think they're right. They both think I'm in the wrong position." He handed back her tablet. "That means they'll both come in force, and when they get here, they'll have to coordinate with each other to manage a joint operation at a neutral site. They'll have to talk to each other. And while they're talking," she said. "We go," he said. She looked at him, at the hot spring behind him, at the steam rising off the water in copper-tinged columns in the flat alien light. She thought about the recall order sitting in her message queue. She thought about the debrief, the disciplinary review, the probable reassignment to archival work. She thought about the 3-year-old operation file buried in her backup archive, the one she had been part of, the coordination with the Varek faction, the recovery of the navigational cache, and the thing that had bothered her about it for 3 years without her being able to name it. She could name it now. It had bothered her because the operation had treated location as an object. The navigational data had described places where people lived. Neither faction had consulted those people. Neither faction had considered consulting them. They were not in either faction's framework the kind of entities whose input was required. The places existed as data. The data existed to be retrieved. "What's the story you're in right now?" she said. "The one you're living inside." He thought about it. "Classic escape structure," he said. Man leaves prison. The prison is extremely sophisticated, built by very intelligent people who were absolutely certain it was complete. He glanced at her. "The trick is always the same." "What trick?" "The architects modeled every action the prisoner might take, every predictable response. What they didn't model was what the prisoner actually wanted. Specifically what this particular prisoner wanted. Because they assumed that a prisoner just wants freedom in the abstract. They didn't consider that a specific person might want something particular enough that the prison wasn't even designed to contain it. The want was invisible to the architects because they never thought to ask what it was." He paused. "The Varek never asked me what I wanted. The Solon never asked. Their models predicted my behavior based on what a cognitively enhanced subject ought to want. Not what I actually want." "What do you want?" she said, for the third time. "Differently than the first two." "I already told you," he said. She was quiet. "To read ahead," she said. He nodded. The ships appeared on the horizon 17 minutes later. Points of light dropping through the purple cloud cover, precise and certain, carrying all their institutional weight with them. They landed 200 meters from the hot spring in a coordinated pattern that required the Varek and Solon commanders to exchange at least 47 communications, which was 47 more than either faction's command structure was comfortable with, and which occupied both commanders' complete attention for the duration. Kale and Avith were gone before the first ship touched down. They went through the thermal venting network, a series of subsurface channels the indigenous Thresh had mapped and used for centuries. The roots encoded in the cultural history that both factions had in their archives, and neither had bothered to read carefully. The cargo hauler was where Kyle had known it would be, registered in the facility's logistics records as decommissioned, sitting in a secondary maintenance bay at the civilian port, technically non-operational, actually functional. He had read the decommissioning report on the second day in Bay 7, and had been carrying the information ever since, not knowing when he would need it, knowing that he would. He checked the controls. They were straightforward. He had read the manual. "You could come," he said. Avith stood at the edge of the landing pad. "Not yet," she said. He looked at her. He had the look he always had when he was between books, returned from somewhere, present again in the room, evaluating what was true and what was next. "Will you be all right?" "I'll be fine." She meant it. "I have reading to do." He almost smiled at this. "I'll send word," he said, "when I find what's out there." The ship was old and noisy, and the ion trail it left was irregular, hard to track because the decommissioning process had left the exhaust manifold slightly misaligned, which produced a signature that didn't match the registered profile and sent the Varek tracking arrays in 3 different wrong directions before they recalibrated. Kale had noted this in the decommissioning report. She watched it climb. She watched it until it cleared the purple cloud cover and became a point of light like any other point of light, and then it was gone. The debrief lasted 4 days. Avith answered every question. She told them about the safe house, the neutral springs, the letter he'd left on the rock. She told them what he had said, about narrative cognition, about the want the architects hadn't modeled, about the gap between what a cognitively enhanced subject was supposed to want, and what this particular one actually wanted. She told them about the Thresh cultural history and the subsurface thermal channels and the decommissioned cargo hauler. They asked where he was. She said she genuinely didn't know. This was true. He had told her he would send word when he found the unread territory, and she believed him, and she did not know when that would be, or where from, or in what form. She knew how to recognize it when it came, because she was a xenolinguist, and recognizing messages was what she did. That was something she kept to herself. The Solon command compiled her disciplinary file with thoroughness and some satisfaction. She was reassigned to archival translation work, the least glamorous posting in the xenolinguistics division, A subterranean office full of decades-old diplomatic transcripts and trade negotiations and census data from border populations. Routine materials. Nothing sensitive. The kind of posting designed to make a person feel that their usefulness had ended. She started reading the census records. She read them in order, oldest first. She was a linguist. She understood that information was always a door, always leverage, always the thing you reached for before you needed it, if you had the wit to pick it up when you first encountered it. She read, and she waited. In the border census records from the Outer Thresh territories, 17 months into her archival posting, she found a registration entry for a small cargo hauler. Decommissioned designation. Filed under the Indigenous Thresh naming convention, in the language both factions had in their archives, and neither had fully decoded. The entry included coordinates, not for a dock or a port, but for a place. A specific place in the uncharted Thresh outer territories that both factions knew existed, and neither had sent an expedition to, because the sensor interference was too severe to map reliably. Avith looked at the coordinates for a long time. She thought about the character who survives being the one who understands what story they're in. She submitted her resignation from the Solon Xenolinguistics Division, with 3 days' notice and a final report that was, by archival standards, unusually thorough. Then she went to find out what story she was in. The Varric and the Solon never officially closed Project Threshold. The file remained open, updated periodically with unconfirmed sensor readings, and fragmented ion trail data and reports from border posts almost signals in the Outer Thresh territories. Signals that didn't match any registered vessel profile, that appeared and vanished without pattern, that the modeling arrays consistently failed to predict or explain. Both factions continued to allocate budget to the recovery effort for 11 years. Neither was willing to be the one that admitted, officially, that a single human man had walked out of the most sophisticated containment facility in the Thresh territories, with nothing but a book under his arm, and a mind that worked like a story, and had outmaneuvered 2 interstellar superpowers not through violence or superior technology or strategic genius of the kind either faction recognized as genius, but through the very specific human capacity to live so completely inside the current moment, inside the rules of whatever world they were in, that the people trying to predict their behavior simply couldn't model it, because the model required knowing what the person wanted, and they had never thought to ask. Somewhere in the outer territories, in the uncharted space between known charts and whatever came after, something was reading, not cataloging, not computing, not retrieving, reading, living in it. Moving through what comes next, the way a person moves through a room they know better than its architects ever did. By feel, by attention, by the accumulated knowledge of someone who has been there long enough to understand what the blueprints missed. The universe, it turned out, had a great deal of unread territory. A human was working through it, one story at a time. And somewhere in an archival office that smelled of old records and recycled air, a xenolinguist was reading old census files with the focused attention of someone who is not doing what it looks like they are doing, who has understood, finally, fully, what it means to know what story you're in. She was in a story about finding what's out there. She was in the part just before it gets good. The outer territories had no agreed-upon name. The Varric called them the Thresh Margins, in the way that large organizations name things they haven't fully processed, giving them a label to file them under rather than a name that reflected what they were. The Solon called them the Interstitial Range, which was more accurate in a technical sense, and equally useless as a description of what it felt like to be there. What it felt like to be there was enormous and quiet, and full of things that had been there long before faction arrived, and would be there long after both factions had become the kind of historical footnote that only dedicated archivists read in subterranean offices, in the small hours, because they are looking for something specific and patient enough to find it. Kale had been in the outer territories for 3 months when he found the first of them. He had been following a signal, not a transmission, nothing so organized. A pattern in the background radiation that his mind had flagged as structured, the way a reader's eye catches a word in a dense page of text, without consciously scanning for it. The pattern surfacing through the noise. Because some part of him had been trained to notice pattern the way others were trained to notice threat. He had been trained on stories, and stories had a grammar, a deep structure of cause and effect and echo and consequence, and the radiation pattern had the quality of something that had a grammar. He followed it for 11 days. The source was a structure on an unmapped moon in the outer Thresh system. Not a ruin exactly, because ruin implies that something was once complete and has since decayed, and this thing had the quality of something that had been deliberately left. An archive, he thought, when he first stood in it, though that word was wrong too because archives store what has already happened, and this place had the quality of something oriented toward what comes next. There were records here in 8 languages he had never encountered, stored in formats he could not immediately access, layered over each other in a way that suggested multiple civilizations had found this place and added to it, one after another, each one working with what the previous ones had left. He spent 6 weeks there, reading what he could access. What he could access was enough to understand that both the Varric and the Solon were young, by the standards of what had come before. Young and certain of themselves, in the way that young things are certain, confidently, without the specific texture of confidence that comes from having been wrong enough times to understand what being wrong feels like. The civilizations that had left this archive had been wrong many times. The records they'd left were, in part, a catalog of those wrongnesses, not as cautionary tales, which was the human genre for such things, but as something more useful, as a record of what the wrongness had taught them, what doors it had opened, what unread territory it had pushed them into. He read for 6 weeks, then he added something. He added it in Russian first, because Russian was the language of his invented childhood, the language his imaginary mother had read to him in, the language that felt most like the inside of his own head. Then he translated it into 4 other languages he had learned since leaving Bay 7, including one of the 8 archive languages he'd partially decoded. The entry was short. It said approximately, "A human was here and learned something," and went on. The something he had learned was this: the universe does not sort itself into those who know and those who don't, into those with power and those subject to it, into those whose input is required and those whose consultation is optional. The universe is a story. All of us are in it. The ones who understand this, who live inside it rather than trying to stand outside it and categorize it, are the ones who find out what happens next. He left the archive and went on. The message arrived in Ava's data terminal 17 months and 3 days after she left the Solon Xenolinguistics division. She was in the outer Thresh territories by then, in a small vessel of her own. A research ship, technically, though her research credentials had not survived her resignation, and the ship was registered under a name that referenced an indigenous Thresh concept that neither the Varric nor the Solon had ever thought to run through their databases. The concept meant, approximately, someone who goes to where the maps run out. The message was in Russian. Her Russian was excellent. It said, "Found something. Coming back to show you. Bring reading material." The next part is long. Below that, coordinates. Below the coordinates, a postscript. "I finished the romance. The lighthouse keeper was right. It was worth going back to the wrong coast." She set her course. Outside the viewport, the outer Thresh territories extended in every direction, enormous and quiet, and full of unread things, structures and signals and patterns in the background noise, a universe of stories waiting for someone to live inside them, long enough to understand what the rules were, what doors were hidden in the walls, what happened in the part that came after the part that everyone already knew. She had been a xenolinguist. She understood better than most that meaning was made in the encounter between minds, that a story without a reader was just marks on a surface, that understanding required at least 2, the one who went ahead and the one who understood what they'd found. She was the second one. She had always been the second one. She was very good at it. She read ahead, preparing. She was in the part just before it gets good, and she could feel, with the specific sense that readers develop, the shape of what was coming. Not the specific events, not the exact shape of the territory on the other side of the horizon, but the quality of it. The feel of a story that still had most of its pages unturned. The weight of something that was only in its early chapters. Outside, the outer territories continued to be enormous. They were not, it turned out, empty. They were full of things that neither faction had looked at carefully. Full of structures and signals and the patient, accumulated records of civilizations that had been wrong enough times to become wise. Full of unread territory that became real, that became a story, when someone finally arrived to live inside it. The ship ran quietly through the dark. She read. She waited. She went toward what was next. The second archive he found was larger. It was also, in ways that took him 3 months to understand, older, old enough that some of the languages in it were ancestral to languages he already knew. protoforms of Varrock and Solon tongues distorted by time into something their current speakers would not recognize. The way a face in an old photograph is and isn't the face of the person standing in front of you now. He spent the 3 months learning the oldest layer. He learned it the way he learned everything. By moving in, by living inside it long enough that the rules of it became his rules, the way a new city becomes navigable. Not through memorizing maps, but through the accumulation of walks. The way the corner that confused you yesterday stops confusing you because you've been past it enough times that your body knows the turn before your mind decides to make it. He was in the 3rd month, deep in a section of the archive that dealt with something he'd been translating, provisionally, as the study of why things persist, when he found the entry that made him sit down on the archive floor and stay there for a long time. It was in a language he decoded well enough to read, though not well enough to be certain of every nuance. The entry described a civilization that had spent 400 years trying to engineer the perfect mind, a cognitive architecture that could process all available information, predict all available outcomes, model all possible futures with sufficient accuracy to remove uncertainty from their decision-making processes entirely. They had succeeded, eventually, after a fashion. The perfect mind they'd built had looked at all available information, processed all available outcomes, modeled all possible futures. Then it had done something its architects had not predicted. It had identified the specific inputs that were missing from its models, the information it hadn't been given, the voices that hadn't been consulted, the wants that hadn't been asked, the stories that hadn't been told. It had asked for them. The civilization, confronted with a mind that was asking them what they actually wanted, had found the question more difficult to answer than any strategic calculation they'd previously attempted. They weren't used to being asked. They were used to deciding. The distinction, the archive entry observed in the dry, analytic tone of something written at great distance from the events it described, turned out to be quite significant. Cale sat on the archive floor and thought about this for a long time. He thought about Bay 7, and the books, and the ventilation manual, and the chess games played at 82%. He thought about the question Avith had asked him 3 times, each time differently, until the 3rd time had gotten a true answer. He thought about the entry he had left in the first archive, about what it meant to live inside a story rather than outside it, and about the specific human texture of that kind of living. Not the grand architecture of it, but the small things. The bread in his jacket pocket, the romance novel, the hot spring that smelled of copper, the moment of standing under an alien sky and just looking at it, the way his imaginary mother had taught his imaginary self to stop and look at things, to be present inside them rather than in transit through them. The perfect mind, the archive said, had understood everything about how the universe worked. What it hadn't understood, what had taken it another generation to learn, and the learning had changed it fundamentally, was why any of it mattered to anyone specific. Why a particular person, in a particular moment, standing under a particular sky, wanted the thing they wanted. Why that wanting was not noise in the system. Why it was in fact the system. He read the rest of the entry. Then he added to it. He added in 5 languages this time, including the oldest layer of the archive's oldest language, which he'd gotten proficient enough in to trust. The addition said, "A human found this and recognized the shape of what you're describing. We call it something different. We have many words for it. Some from stories about detectives, some from stories about wars, some from very long books about lighthouses and the wrong coast and the particular stubbornness of going back to something until you understand it. The word I keep coming back to is presence, the state of being actually inside the moment you're in, rather than calculating it from the outside. The state that your perfect mind had to be taught and that most humans have by default, so naturally that we don't notice it as a capability until someone tries to take it away. The state that makes the blueprint useless and the lived experience irreplaceable. The state that looks from the outside like irrationality and is from the inside the most precise instrument we have for navigating real things in real time." He paused, stylus hovering. Then he added, "We're better at this than you might expect. We've had a lot of practice. The universe kept trying to be too large and too strange and too indifferent for us to survive in, and we survived anyway, not because we computed our way through it, but because we learned to live inside it, fully, one present moment at a time. This is what we are. This is the thing your models keep missing. This is the want you forgot to ask about." He set the stylus down. He looked at the archive around him. All of it. the accumulated records of civilizations that had found this place and added their piece and gone on, each one pushing into the unread territory, each one learning from the wrongnesses, each one leaving something for whoever came next. He felt, for the first time since waking up in Bay 7, something he recognized from the very best books. The specific sense of arriving at the sentence that explains why everything before it was worth reading. Not an ending, the thing that makes you understand what the story was actually about. He stayed in the archive for another week, reading everything he could access. Then he set his course back toward the coordinates he had sent to Avith, and he flew through the outer territories. And he thought about presence, and what comes next, and the difference between a story that is happening to you and a story you are living inside by choice. The difference, he had concluded, was everything. It was specifically the thing that neither the Varric nor the Solon had ever managed to quantify, and why every model they built kept coming up short, and why a man with a book under his arm and a piece of bread in his jacket had walked out of their most sophisticated installation and into the largest unread thing there was, and kept reading. Outside the outer territories continued. He flew toward what was next.